I recently purchased the Secret Wars Wave 2 Falcon and Magik, and in a separate video I talked about Constrictor, Absorbing Man, and Spider-Man, and all the little design decisions that don't make much sense. Now it's time to talk about these guys, and I want to emphasize something. This is not a review. This is more like an audit. How is Hasbro utilizing their budget effectively? And from that perspective, Daredevil might be the worst of the wave. I'm Glen, and this is Super Articulated. So let's take a look at Falcon first. I want to emphasize the difference between a review and an audit. As a consumer or as a collector of Marvel Legends, I might say that I'm sick of the Sunfire body. But from Hasbro's perspective, they get to use a mold that they created 10 years ago again. But also from their perspective, this body mold has been around for a decade. They've amassed a giant library of alternate pieces for this buck. So much so that either the Legends team or the factory that this was made from screwed up the butterfly joints on this figure. And for a quick backstory, the original Sunfire body had very small shoulders that plugged almost into the rib cage of the figure. And about a year later, they released the Shang-Chi body, which re-sculpted the butterfly joints and the shoulders so that they were both larger and sat higher. And then they forgot about those new parts until the 2018-2019 Gamerverse Mr. Fix-It wave that had a dedicated Falcon figure on this body. It either reused or again remolded those newer butterfly joints and the larger shoulders. Their library of interchangeable pieces is so large that they accidentally included that original Sunfire butterfly joint on this figure instead of the newer butterfly joint that was used on that old Falcon. That is a distinct disadvantage of using the same mold for 10 years. And aside from the accidental regression of those molded parts, Falcon here has two distinct design flaws. The problem with these wings is that they peg into the arm at two different points, effectively rendering his arm into a statue. Now, they could have reused parts and used less material for new parts if they had just included Falcon's, or actually Vulture's, original top wing. It attaches to the upper arm and allows the elbow to bend, retaining range of motion. And also, if they had just made this lower piece, smaller, they'd actually been able to retain the shape of the wing, even when it was articulated. But instead, the arms are forced into one position. And for the consumer, that reduces posability, playability, and that's not something that should be cost reduced. Now, the other odd design choice is with the lower legs. Instead of just reusing the standard lower leg and using an overlay to create the shin guard and tassels, they split the two pieces into two separate parts so that the shin guard, whatever you want to call it, is pegged into the mid leg, rotating at the calf, and also rotating just below the tassels. Now, the problem with this is that this is a hyper-specific design that honestly just wastes your tooling budget. The exact same thing could have been achieved if they had just used an overlay. They wouldn't have had to create two distinct pieces, they would have only had to create one. And maybe they wanted to avoid a situation like with that original Jim Lee Cyclops figure where the bands around his legs would just fall off. But from my perspective, this is an action figure. It's okay if the shin guards didn't stay in place. And if it really bothers the collector, they can do what I did on that original Jim Lee Cyclops and just glue it in place. Also, his head is too big and the colors remind me of McDonald's, but this isn't a review. All right, let's get Falcon out of the way. Whoops. Talk about Magik. Magik. Interesting character choice. She definitely wasn't a part of the original Secret Wars toy line, and I don't think she was even around for the original Secret Wars story, but she's big in Marvel Rivals right now, so I guess this kind of makes sense. Magik is on what appears to be a very standard body, but I think it's actually all new. I think this might be a replacement body for that female teenage buck that was in the 2014-15 Ultimate Green Goblin wave. She does look a little bit taller, which makes me think this is different, but let's talk about the good aspects of her design first. Now, when it comes to her arm, her shoulder pads specifically, I remember that they had just so much trouble trying to figure out how shoulder pads should work on action figures. And it really is such a simple design choice that works perfectly. It used to be that shoulder pads were sort of built into the shoulder itself, and they would sort of hinge up and down. But on Magik here, you can turn this arm all the way around, and that shoulder pad sticks with it. And that's because the shoulder pad just wraps around the little pin that goes from the shoulder into the actual torso. It's such a simple and cheap design choice, and it works so perfectly. And with this being what I believe to be an all-new sculpt, someone correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, they give her double-jointed elbows, and they give her an actual boot cut. And now, finally, it seems like female figures have been brought up to par with the standard set in 2012. You know, people like to say that female figures don't sell as well as their male counterparts, but gee, I wonder why. So, there were a couple of not great decisions made with this figure. They decoed the sides of her hips with some black to shape the uniform a little bit more, and I don't think that was utilized well here because there's a break in the sculpt. It goes from yellow plastic to black, and because of the way that the lower torso is sculpted, you can see the yellow of the inner cavity of her hips just from standing in a normal position. It goes from yellow to black to yellow to black. And that is a bit distracting. If they had just foregone the deco hits entirely and just utilized the break in the sculpt as the break in the costume, that would have worked just as fine. And the second fault that I find with this figure is pretty egregious. As long as I've been collecting, this is something that I have never seen before. Excuse the posing, but from this perspective, the sculpt looks fine, except when you move the belt. Do you see that? Do you see how the lower torso has an indented key in place for her belt? What a completely unnecessary, hyper-specific design choice that just means that if they want to release a character on this body, they're going to have to resculpt and remold that lower torso, and that's just a waste of money. In addition, they've taken away choice from the consumer. What if a collector wanted her belt to sit a little bit higher or sit more on her hips? If they try and do either of those things, that indent is going to be visible and obvious. And you know what's funny? When the belt is sitting high up on her waist, the shape of the torso, number one, reminds me of a diaper, and number two, reminds me of that old Toy Biz Wasp figure. But in the end, as a collector, it's nice to get a fudgeable classic Magik. Now we can actually start filling out that original New Mutants team. But if you thought that torso was egregious, you are going to hate the new Daredevil figure. Before we get into Daredevil, before we even get into what is good and bad about its design, I want to talk about sort of what it means to be a Marvel Legends collector. Marvel Legends is all about quantity over quality. And to me, that's great. That allows Hasbro to delve deep into some of the more outrageous Z-list characters. And there are design choices that you make as a toy company that reinforces that design philosophy. And that generally means making generic bodies that can be reused over and over again. Think Falcon. Think about that Sunfire mold that has been used for 10 years. When I first saw Daredevil, it seemed to me that this was a replacement for that Sunfire body, but now I'm not so sure. But first I want to go over the good stuff. I love this little accessory that represents his sonic vision, basically. If I were Hasbro, I would be very unhappy to be including generic accessories like guns when I have to pay 20+% licensing fees on those pieces. These are the kinds of accessories that, if I were Hasbro, I would want to make. Plenty of people have already pointed this out, but instead of just reusing those same batons that they've been using for the last 10 years, they sculpted new batons and they included this little peg piece that I can't even get out right now, that is removable so that you can have two batons that are of the same length. Now, I think the only problem is that this piece is extremely small. One of the smallest pieces that I think I've ever seen included with a Marvel Legends figure. But the good thing is that he includes a holster that you can just kind of plop that in. Just don't tip it over and have it fall under the carpet where it'll never be seen again. The other thing I like about this particular Daredevil is that it is a true throwback to that original Secret Wars figure. It includes the large black double D's on his chest logo, and they even include the deco hits on his feet. Now, they've extended the design philosophy, so they added a couple of black lines on the forearms that is sort of a natural extension of that deco design. Honestly, I think that was a great idea. The only thing I might have done differently is to change the color of the swivel hinge in his ankle to black, just to continue that, I don't know, what's the word, motif of that black line running down his belt. Would have been a little bit thick, but at least it wouldn't have broken up the deco design. But honestly, for me, that is where the good design ends. If I were to review this figure, I would point out how absolutely rectangular it looks, and not in the good way. If you look at his legs, there's just so little variation in the width between the thighs, the calves, and his ankles. And the same goes for the torso. There's very little taper between his waist and chest. The arms are okay. The forearms look a little Popeye-ish. When you turn it to its side, he's got like no back. And when you compare that to the Mafex Daredevil, which I'm gonna get real quick, but just compare the two. Just look at the curve to his back. It looks like he actually has a spine. It's not dynamic. It's not both what an action figure and a superhero should look like, in my opinion. In addition, do you remember how I said that they eventually fixed how low the Sunfire Body's shoulders sat on his torso? Well, they kind of fucked it up again on this figure. Once again, the circle of the butterfly joint is complete instead of shearing off the top and bottom, forcing the shoulder to sit below where it should be, and it looks like it's just coming out of the ribcage. And because of the length of the arms, I don't think that was the sculptor's fault. This feels like a design decision that was made by someone working at the factory in China. Maybe they felt like something wasn't going to mold right if they had done it how they had previously been done. And also, I mean, this is common for Marvel Legends, but the hands are gigantic. I'm pretty sure from wrist to the end of his finger, it's the same length as his forearm. I don't know. It's not very superheroic. If you thought the hyper-specific sculpting on Magik was bad, it's exponentially worse on Daredevil. Look at that. Is that not ridiculous? It is such a baffling design decision. Because what if you wanted to reuse this body mold for a character that doesn't have a belt? Now you have to resculpt both pieces of that lower torso. I mean, on older Daredevil figures, the belt just being a floating piece worked fine, but now they're taking away your choice as a consumer. They're forcing you to have this belt exactly where they want it to be. Now let's extend this philosophy of anti-reuse to his holster. On the older Daredevil figures, the designers acknowledged that these were toys, these were action figures that were going to be reused over and over. But not only has Hasbro keyed in the holster into his thigh, but sculpted on the strap as if they were trying to emulate the Mafex figure. And because of the way that pinless limbs work, if they wanted to reuse this sculpt for a character that doesn't have a holster on his left thigh, they would have to remold the entire leg to do it. And even though you can barely see it, this figure also has sculpted underwear on the outside of his costume. And again, if a character doesn't have that costume detailing or has a costume design that would break up that sculpt, they can't do that character on this body without resculpting the four pieces that make up his hips. Now, I think the worst part, the worst design choice that they could make on figures like this with pinless limbs set up the way they are, is to include the sculpted bunching of the costume at the elbows and the knees. What if you wanted to release a character like Khazar or Namor on this body, where his costume is literally that he's just mostly naked? Now, not only do you have to resculpt that lower torso to get rid of the key of the belt, resculpt the left leg to get rid of the holster and strap, but now you have to resculpt, let's see, the boots, all of the leg, and all of the arm and hands to be able to achieve that. What a colossal waste of your budget that could have been totally avoided if you had just made that belt an overlay, made the holster an overlay that's removable, made the limbs look like they were essentially naked. I mean, that's what superheroes are. Typically, those costume detailings weren't included on the original comic book art back in the day because they were just trying to turn out page after page after page. It's kind of what made comic book superheroes eye-catching. I make it sound so dramatic, but when you're looking at Daredevil in a vacuum, he's a fine figure. He's probably the best of the wave. But I'm genuinely trying to see the larger picture. I'm trying to see the consequences that design choices like these make, especially when this figure is so specific to Daredevil. I mean, we already have import companies for that. And I'm sorry, one more thing that disappoints me about Daredevil. In order for this figure to make back its tooling budget, it's gonna have to stick around for years. And to me, this super articulated torso just represents stagnation, something that was novel 10 years ago in 2016, but now is half a decade behind the competition. They make it so much easier for me not to buy Marvel Legends. It's a bit of a downer to end it on, but thank you for watching. If you liked this video, I would appreciate if you hit the like button. I'm trying to make new videos every week, and I might shoot the next one right now, honestly, so subscribe to see that. In the comments, let me know if I'm just being silly or if you actually agree with any of the observations that I've been making throughout this video. Phone users, if you really like what I've been doing, I would very much appreciate if you hyped this video. I think if enough people do it, it really boosts the reach potential. I gotta go walk my dog, so I'm Glenn, and this is Articulated. Not articulated, super articulated. What the fuck? I regressed 5 years. And that saves them money. That prevents them from having to, whoa. There's a fly down here. And in addition, get out of here, fly. Fuck off. Fuck off, don't bother me. And in addition,